For the sake of simplicity, today OLAW will only be talking about animal agreements involving domestic institutions. If you have questions involving a foreign institution, please reach out to the OLAW Division of Assurances, and I've included their email here. Today we're going to talk about the basics: the why, the what, the where, the when, and the who. Why formal written agreements are important, what needs to be in a formal written agreement, spoiler alert, it's nothing new, where to put the necessary information, when a formal written agreement is needed, and who is responsible for the formal written agreement. So this is nuanced stuff, and I know everybody has a lot to do, and some of you might have more than one thing going on in your office or on your computer right now, but I want to give you a heads up that every part of this presentation is going to build off the previous material, so it's going to be really important that you don't miss anything, or you might miss the connecting pieces as we go through. So first, we're going to talk about the why of formal written agreements, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the what and the when. But before we do, I want to set the stage for our discussion with this cute little confused burrowing owl and talk about the importance of words. I love this quote by Stan Kaplan, who, in a bit of tongue-in-cheek humor, wrote these two theorems on why confusion happens. Theorem 1 is that 50% of the problems in the world result from people using the same words with different meanings. And theorem 2 is that the other 50% comes from people using different words with the same meaning. It can be really helpful when approaching questions about the topic of MOUs and agreements by taking a step back and asking yourself, okay, is this a question of theorem 1 or theorem 2? And of course, it may not always be that simple, but this is a really, really good place to start. And so with that in mind, I want us to start at the very, very beginning, before we even get into what OLAW or NIH or anyone else has to say about agreements. I invite you to step out of your role at your institution and take the 50,000-foot view. So let's say two institutions decide to collaborate. And remember, we're going to confine our discussion today to two domestic institutions. Real money and or property will be shared. And your life experience and mine and good common sense says that somebody should probably be keeping track of who gets what, where everything is, and who is responsible. And it would be wise to have that written down somewhere. As the old adage goes, if it's not written, it didn't happen. But notice that we haven't talked about any specific types of documents yet. We'll just refer to them as written agreements. So stay with me, don't jump ahead. It's important to remember that at the end of the day, written agreements are for your benefit. They protect you, your people, and your animals. Just from a conceptual standpoint, you're going to want to make things clear at the start of the collaboration so that all requirements are met and there isn't a situation where each of you thought the other would take care of something and then it slips through the cracks. When hundreds of thousands of dollars, equipment, and supplies are on the line, and animals and people are going to be affected by your decisions, errors and omissions can be costly and have serious repercussions. And you're going to want to have something to go back to when questions or problems arise. With that background, let's talk about what goes into a written agreement. And we're going to start with the basics. OLAW's guidance on written agreements comes from the NIH grants policy statement, the should statement in the guide about collaborations, and OLAW's FAQs. Once again, we still haven't talked about any specific document types. So stay with me, resist the urge to jump ahead. Let's talk about the NIH grants policy statement first. The NIH grants policy statement section 15.2.1 requires, as a condition of award, that collaborations have a formal written agreement that addresses the negotiated arrangements necessary to ensure compliance with all applicable federal regulations and policies. That includes the PHS policy. You'll notice that it does specify administrative and reporting requirements in the list of things to include, both of which apply to carrying out animal work. Don't worry, this has been around for quite some time. We just tried to make this more clear in our updated FAQ, which we'll get to in a minute. The NIH grants policy statement expects compliance with the PHS policy, and the PHS policy requires institutions to base their program on the guide. Now, of course, the NIH grants policy statement only applies to NIH-funded activities. However, remember that even if the activity is not funded by NIH, assured institutions are still required to base their program on the guide anyway as part of compliance with the PHS policy. The guide further explains what those administrative considerations to cover in the written agreement are. And you can see that here in the quote from page 15 of the guide on the slide. Things like the responsibility for animal care and use, ownership, IACUC review, and IACUC oversight. Again, notice that the guide only specifies a formal written agreement. It gives some examples, but they're just that, examples. The exact document type is not specified because it will depend on the circumstances, which we'll get to down the road. Now, you might say, well, that's a should statement, so technically it isn't a requirement. However, remember that when an activity is subject to the PHS policy, OLAW expects institutions will follow a should statement unless there is an IACUC-approved scientific justification, veterinary, or animal welfare reason for departing from this expectation. The short version is, if your work is funded or supported by NIH, the NIH grants policy statement requirement applies, and the guide provides more detail on how to address that expectation. For activities at assured institutions that are not funded by NIH, but are still subject to the PHS policy, the guide still applies. So you can see I've tried to depict that in the stack diagram here. To help make this more clear, in 2024, we updated our FAQ on collaborations, FAQ D8, to bring both the NIH grants policy statement and guide references into one place. Nothing new, it's just all pulled together for you in one easy place. In the FAQ, there is a section titled Institutions are required to have a written agreement. Here's the salient part of that section. Collaborating institutions must have a formal written agreement addressing the scientific, administrative, financial, and reporting requirements of the award. Compliance with the PHS policy and other applicable animal welfare regulations is a minimum requirement for the receipt of NIH funds. The guide also describes responsibilities that should be included in a formal written understanding. Again, note that the exact document is not specified. An example is given, which I have skipped over for a moment with the ellipsis, but again, it's just an example. As an additional helpful measure, the FAQ also pulls in a reminder of the expectations for IACUC oversight as described in the PHS policy, so that you have a very robust package of what you need to know all in one place. The FAQ reminds institutions that IACUC oversight includes semi-annual facility inspection by an IACUC, reporting concerns and other IACUC functions, as well as provides a practical description of how institutions proceed if dual review, and that means if two IACUCs will be reviewing an activity, is elected. So let's take a moment with some poll questions, and you can just put your answer in the chat. NIH-funded activities are subject to the requirements found in A, the NIH grants policy statement, B, the guide, C, both A and B, or D, neither.
All right, thank you, Megan. So in chat, I see C is popping up pretty much exclusively.
Okay, great. That is fantastic. NIH, yes, NIH-funded activities are subject to the requirements found in both the NIH grants policy statement and the guide. So let's do another one. Activities not funded by NIH, but that are subject to the PHS policy are to follow, once again, A, the NIH grants policy statement, B, the guide, C, both A and B, or D, neither. And again, feel free to put your answers in the chat.
All right, so we see B is pretty much exclusively coming up here.
Fantastic, that is correct. Activities not funded by NIH, but that are subject to the PHS policy are to follow the guide. Pardon me. Okay, so let's take a look at the where, as in where to put that information or what kinds of documents are we talking about. There are a lot of different agreements out there. For example, Memoranda of Understanding or MOUs, Material Transfer Agreements, contracts, interinstitutional agreements, which are different from the OLAW interinstitutional assurance, so don't get confused, and so on and so forth. If you take a step back, like we talked about at the beginning, these are all very general words. If you look these up, you'll get varying overlapping definitions. There are infinite ways to achieve the same goal based on the circumstances and needs of the institution. A good way to think about it is to compare it to making a meal. The concepts are the ingredients, the document is the dish, and the collaboration is the meal. You can have a one-pot meal or a meal with many dishes, and your meals might look different from your neighbors. Oops, sorry. And harkening back to our slide at the beginning about the importance of words, the terminology may differ from place to place, and this is important. Just like each person tastes things differently, different words may have different connotations or meanings from one institution from another. So what do these documents look like? How exactly do you fill these out? To put it simply, it depends on what you're having the parties agree to. But it's also going to depend a lot on your legal counsel and institutional policies, whether you call it an MOU or contract or agreement, and the exact contents and the wording are going to depend on the specific needs, legal climate, and risk tolerance of your institution. At OLAW, we like the term MOU because it is general enough to get the point across without being too ambiguous, but really it comes down to a formal written agreement of some kind. To give you a starting point, FDP created an MOU template, which we have put up on our website, along with a great webinar explaining the document. The resources are on the MOU page in the OLAW sample document section, but remember that OLAW is focused on the concepts as described in the NIH grants policy statement, the guide, and compliance with the PHS policy. We don't require you to use the template as long as you cover all the applicable concepts. Version 2.0 of FAQ-D8 was created to give you easy reference to that list of concepts to cover. You can go to the second half of that FAQ at any time and see the NIH grants policy statement and guide list. Okay, so now that we know what documents we may be working with, let's talk about when you use them. And this is actually really simple. When do I use a formal written agreement? If your activity is NIH funded, and or if your activity is subject to the PHS policy and the guide, which remember, that all institutions are required by the PHS policy to base their animal care and use program on the guide. So don't overcomplicate it. Just remember, written agreements protect you, your people, and your animals. Okay, so now we know why, what, where, and when. The last thing to cover is who. Who is responsible for the formal written agreement? First, these agreements are established between the collaborating parties. Second, for NIH-funded activities, the primary awardee institution as a whole is responsible. The NIH grants policy statement says the primary recipient is responsible for fulfilling the obligations of an award and including these obligations in agreements with collaborating institutions. To go back to our dinner analogy, the institution designs the menu and designates the chefs. The individual departments will handle each part of the meal. Collaborations often involve many departments, from grants and funding to the IACUC, PIs, etc. You have a lot of flexibility, and sometimes that freedom can be disconcerting, but you have lots of places to turn to for support, both inside your institution and outside, such as in professional organizations like this. And of course, OLAW is only a phone call away. And remember, the purpose of written agreements is to protect you, your people, and your animals. So use them in light of that purpose. And just a quick note about other documents. One of the reasons people tend to overcomplicate the question of MOUs and written agreements is because they sometimes mix them up with the OLAW assurance. They are two completely separate things. When there will be a collaboration involving animal activities that is supported by PHS funds, you have to have both in some form. You need a written agreement that includes the logistical administrative aspects of animal care and use in the collaboration, the who does what. That's pretty easy. And the activities need to be covered under someone's assurance. This can be a little more complex. And for those that might be newer to the field, just to provide some more detailed disambiguation about the distinction between the formal written agreement and the OLAW assurance, the formal written agreement is established between the collaborating parties. It is a document designed by and for the institutions themselves and addresses the necessities and logistics of the collaboration. Because this is something between the parties themselves, when they get it together depends on their administrative needs. Specifically, the guide mentions that it should include the responsibilities of off-site animal care and use, animal ownership, and IACUC review and oversight, which I will remind you that OLAW's FAQ D8 has some helpful measures, has some helpful reminders about what IACUC oversight entails according to the PHS policy. In contrast, assurances are established between institutions and OLAW. OLAW sets the requirements for what must be in the assurance. The PHS policy defines the OLAW assurance as, and I've added a couple of clarifying words in brackets here, documentation from an institution to OLAW, assuring institutional compliance with the PHS policy. It's a comprehensive document describing the entire animal care and use program, including who's the institutional official, etc. It's an affirmation to OLAW that the program will comply with the PHS policy, but once again, it's between the institution and OLAW. So hopefully you can see very clearly that they are two completely separate things, and you need both. So great, you need both a formal written agreement and an assurance, but what kind of assurance? Remember, the assurance is between the individual institution and OLAW, so there always has to be an assurance in place before work begins. As to which type of assurance, there are three possibilities. Most of you are probably familiar with the regular OLAW domestic assurance, which is the most common. The OLAW foreign assurance is similar, but is for foreign institutions, and we're not going to go into those today. It's pretty common that both of the institutions in a collaboration will have their own OLAW assurance already, so that's pretty straightforward. But in certain situations, you might also need an OLAW interinstitutional assurance. An OLAW interinstitutional assurance is needed when the primary awardee does not have their own animal care and use program and needs to conduct the work at another performance site. Note that the performance site is required to hold a domestic or foreign assurance with OLAW prior to starting live vertebrate animal work there. The interinstitutional assurance is always used in addition to, not in place of, one of the other two, and applies narrowly to a specific grant or contract. The interinstitutional assurance is sometimes called an IA or an IIA, but it's different from an interinstitutional agreement. An OLAW interinstitutional assurance is a specific type of OLAW assurance that is negotiated between institutions and OLAW. An interinstitutional agreement is a general term that you can use to describe a formal written agreement between institutions, just like MOU or contract like we talked about extensively today. That can be a bit confusing, but remember, it's a case of Theorem 1, like we talked about at the very beginning. Same words, very different meanings. Whether or not you need an OLAW interinstitutional assurance is going to depend on a lot of factors. So OLAW will guide you through this at the time of award. Just remember, regardless of any other documents you have, never begin any PHS-supported activities until there is the correct OLAW assurance in place. This is very, very important. What I want you to take away from this section is that the formal written agreement, such as the MOU, contract agreement, etc., is completely separate from the assurance. And if your institution is contemplating any new collaborations during an ongoing award, make sure to check with NIH first to be sure that OLAW doesn't need some additional documentation. Feel free to reach out with questions, but just don't submit any completed documents directly to OLAW unless the Division of Assurances asks for them, because we don't want you to go to a lot of work for something you might not need. And of course, as always, there may be some super specific situations that may require additional documentation. You can reach out to the Division of Assurances if there are questions. Okay, so here are some helps that we have on our website. As mentioned earlier, as a service to the community, OLAW has provided a link to the MOU template created by FDP and their associated resources. You can find that in the sample documents section on the website, and I've marked with the red boxes what links you'll want to click to get there. Excuse me. As a reminder, use of this template is not required, but it is a fantastic resource that can really give you a head start if you're not sure how to get off the ground. In addition, we have linked a webinar at the bottom of the page that was held at the time that FDP released the template, and it explains in a bit more depth about the document and some of the resources that they put together. Note that the documents themselves are hosted on FDP's website, and so I've highlighted the hyperlink there in the red box, because to access them, you're going to need to go to FDP's documents page and scroll down to the files that you need. Also, at the same time we put up the MOU template page, we put in this little section that hits on some of those common points of confusion. We recently updated these in response to community feedback, so we briefly want to mention them here. Is using this MOU template required by OLAW? No, this example format is not required. This is being offered as a resource to assist institutions if desired. What should be included in a formal written agreement for animal collaborations, such as an MOU or contract? The exact contents of the formal written agreement may depend on the nature of the collaboration, animal activity involved, and the institution's needs. And what is the difference between an MOU and an interinstitutional assurance? And this goes through what the difference is between MOUs and interinstitutional assurances. If you would like to read a little bit more about what an interinstitutional assurance is, you can find that in the sample documents section as well. And finally, when in doubt, reach out. We'd love to answer questions and help you on your way. I've put the email address for both the Division of Policy and Education, that's our division, and the Division of Assurances up here. We're happy to answer questions. You can also call the OLAW main line, and the number's on the slide too.